Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Northwest ATTC webinar. I'm Jennifer Verbeck, and I'm your host for today. We're excited to have Colleen Marshall and Annette Sogaard Nielsen presenting for us on Leaders of Change, Motivational Interviewing for Leaders. A couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for our presenters, please type them into the chat box at any time. After they are finished speaking, I will read the questions in the order that they were received. You'll also be getting an email at the end of today's webinar that has a link to a survey in it. Please take that survey. It helps us make sure we're bringing you the content you're most interested in. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to our website where you'll be able to find a recording of the webinar, and that should be made available later this afternoon. Additionally, we'll be sending everyone who attends this live webinar a certificate of attendance, and that takes us about a week to get those out. You don't need to do anything to get the certificate unless you're watching this in a group. In that case, please have someone in the group email us within a business day with the names and email addresses for everyone who wants their certificate. And our email is up there on the slide. It's northwest@attdcnetwork.org. And then I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. As mentioned earlier, we have Colleen Marshall, who has been a senior leader in behavioral health and behavioral change service delivery and management for more than 15 years. She currently serves as a consultant for startup and healthcare organizations looking to implement motivational interviewing. She is also the director of behavioral health for WELL, which is a digital behavioral change organization. And we also have Anette Sogaard Nielsen, who is a professor at the University of Southern Denmark. Annette has 20 years of experience in leadership and management, primarily as the leader of one of Denmark's largest treatment institutions for alcohol use disorders. Annette has been a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers since 1997. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, my name is Annette. Actually, it's pronounced Anette Sogaard Nielsen for those of you who actually speak Danish. And it's would you like to say hello, Colleen, and start the presentation?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. So welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be with you guys here today. This is actually our first presentation since the launch of the book, and so we're really eager to hear your thoughts, share what we've sort of found in this process of writing this book together, and then also hopefully continue the conversation. So we invite you all to be part of this growing new field of motivational interviewing, specifically in the leadership role. So please join in as we can, and it's so great to see so many of you. It looks like we have quite a bit of you here today, so that's exciting. Thank you for joining us. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's first start by talking about what do we mean by a leader? That word can be used for so many things, and being somebody that's been in organizations for a long time, one of the things I always think is that we're all leaders actually in organizations. How we model, what we emphasize, how we talk at the water cooler, all of us have specific roles that impact organizations and the work organizations do. But when we're talking about leaders in this context, we're actually thinking about people that have specific roles or tasks and are responsible for leading a team or a person. So this can be just someone who is supervising or mentoring just one person. It can be somebody who's the most senior leader or leading a small team. But it's basically somebody who's in charge of leading change in the organization in some context. So either helping individuals change or helping teams change or organizations change. And so with that, we want to think about leaders have many things on their plates that they're responsible for. They're responsible for the strategy, trying to decide where they're going to take the organization and how quickly. They're responsible for planning specific actions. They're also responsible for making sure that the staff are well taken care of and engaged and learning and growing. they're responsible for communication, and they're responsible for the fiscal management of the organization and making sure they meet their deliverables. But one of the things that is most important to leaders is actually leading change. And that you'll see that in many, many articles and books, that there's a lot of focus on helping leaders find the best way to do that. And that can be anything from leading an individual to changing and meeting organizational expectations, to leading an entire organization towards a culture change or a product launch change. And so when we think about that, that's where we thought motivational interviewing is really useful and helpful, that it can start being part of the conversation of how do we help people change. But before we jump into how to MI specifically helps leaders, let's hear from you guys. What do you think defines a good leader? Specifically think about some of the best leaders you've ever had during your work life. And what did they do specifically that you would say made them the best? How did they affect your own growth? And how did they approach change in your organization or with yourself? So go ahead and chat in the chat box over to on the bottom of your screen. And we'll just hear what some of you guys think about what makes a good leader. Empowering us, right? So that, to me, that's the spirit of believing in us, encouraging us, someone who's consistent, right? So trustworthy, consistent, guiding, they're able to listen, they can teach. Wow, look at all these great answers. They lead by example. They're proactive and a great communicator. They share decision-making. They have active listening skills. Good listener, I hear over and over again, challenging and supportive, honest, willing to jump in, they follow through, they're a role model. So many great ideas, and I'll let you guys continue to share those with each other, because when we are talking about leadership, we really are talking about who the leader is, what they value, what they model, but also what do they specifically do. And that relates really nicely to motivational interviewing, because we talk about those two concepts together. And so when Annette and I were thinking about this and writing our book, what we really thought about is we wanted to think about what is the mindset that a good leader needs to have to be able to help people grow. What do they need to think about? And there was a literature review we did, and there was lots of things that came out in any of the books that we've considered to be really good leadership examples. One of my favorites is from Quinn's Walking in a Bridge as You Build It, where he focuses on these 4 concepts of a leader being other-focused, externally open, process-centered, and internally driven. And it was really a nice model of thinking about leaders are really there to learn and grow themselves, but doing that for an outward purpose and to help others, and that they're open to feedback and considerations from others. Covey and others also talked a lot about integrity, honesty, compassion, and trustworthiness, and many of you have already shared that. Those are at the heart of leadership. If we don't have integrity or honesty or compassion, it's really hard to help people really want to follow or lead or trust that we are thinking what's best for them and helping them grow. There were other things that became really clear to us about the mindset leaders might need to have when using motivational interviewing. One of them is having enough time. Sometimes when we're using motivational interviewing, it isn't that someone couldn't change or doesn't have the skill to change or even the motivation to change. It's sometimes that a leader simply doesn't have enough time for the person to make the changes necessary. So leaders need to be clear about the context they're working in when they decide to use motivational interviewing. And one of those is not setting people up to fail and making sure they have enough time for the person to make the changes that they're talking about. A key component is believing the person can change. And I'm sure many of you have examples, just like Annette and I do, where we've worked with people who've already decided somebody is problematic, an employee is problematic, and has already decided that person is not capable of changing. And if that's the belief of that leader, then they really are not the right person to be coaching or helping that person grow. So it's a foundational belief that people can change. Now, whether they will change is not up to us, but us holding the belief that they can is critical for motivational interviewing, and I would postulate for leaders in general. Also believing that they're taking the employee's strengths into consideration, because sometimes the task in front of an employee is more about whether their strengths aren't being matched or maximized, and not really about whether they can or cannot do a task. And so really thinking about how do we maximize employees' strengths as part of our foundation and our mindset. We also want to really focus on ambivalence, or is what we're talking about something else? Oftentimes with leaders, and we'll talk about this with a couple examples in a minute, that what we're seeing if we see an employee who's possibly problematic or not quite meeting expectations, it isn't actually ambivalence we're seeing, it's just they haven't learned something yet, or there's unclear expectations, or the delegation isn't clear. And so sometimes it isn't really about motivational interviewing and trying to resolve ambivalence. It actually is about helping the employee learn something new or being clear in some other tasks that a leader might want to deploy. The leader also, has many tools in their tool belt, and so deciding to use motivational interviewing is a key decision, because MI is definitely helpful, but it is not a panacea and is not necessarily needed to be used in all situations. And then lastly, the leader might need to consider whether they're the right person to have the conversation. They might want to think about somebody else having a conversation about a motivational conversation because of their power dynamic, their role in the organization. They just might not simply be the right role to have this conversation. So there's lots of things to think about for leaders when they're thinking about using motivational interviewing. These are just a few for you guys to start thinking about and considering. But at the heart of it, we really thought that the spirit of motivational interviewing fits nicely with other leadership models out there, being compassionate and acting on behalf of the employees with kindness and empathy, accepting people for who they are and their perspectives and how they view things, working in collaborative partnership with others to help achieve organizational outcomes and employee outcomes. And then this skill of really evoking ideas and solutions from the employee and really believing that our employees do have significant ideas and solutions and suggestions to offer the organization. Just as leaders, we need to create the opportunity for those to come forward. And that's why we think leadership and MI spirit may be hand in hand, and something for us to think about. The other big part of motivational interviewing with leadership is really thinking through very deliberately the ethics involved, because what we really want to protect against is that MI is not a skill that we want to use to manipulate people or get people to do what we want them to do. MI has been designed from the beginning to be a tool that is in the benefit of the person receiving the MI conversation. And so we thought through the many different ways that this can play out. And this is just some of our thinking, but part of why we're keying this up for you all is to think through the ethics of using MI in the specific context and situation that you're facing. Because there are definitely times where we would call it unethical to use motivational interviewing because there are ulterior motives for trying to get an outcome. And so just thinking through this first line, if the employee benefits from the change we're considering, then MI actually ends up being fairly appropriate. And you can see if the leader also personally benefits from the change, MI might be appropriate, but we have to be careful because we have a bias and a desire, and you can imagine that we might be influencing or over-reflecting on one side of the conversation because we now have a sort of personal interest in what the employee decides. In the middle, though, if the leader is not affected either way, whether the employee decides to change or not change, then this is actually the most appropriate time to use it because the employee does benefit from the change, but it's up to them to decide. And if the leader benefits personally from the employee staying the same, but the employee benefits from the change, again, we have a bias, so we have to be careful in how we use it. And if the employee neither loses or benefits, then it's also, we might think about when it's appropriate or not. And if the leader does benefit, but the employee neither does or doesn't lose, then that's where it's a little bit more dangerous because the leader obviously has an influence in guiding the conversation and might also benefit from the employee choice. And lastly, the employee loses by a change, then MA is not appropriate in most situations because the person you wouldn't want to guide them towards making a decision to change if it actually is going to end up hurting the employee, even if it means that it benefits the leader. We also want to take the layer of considering the organization because if both people are working for this organization and leaders have to support the organizational goals, that adds a third layer to our thinking. So we want to, again, think through who's benefiting from this conversation. And if the employee is benefiting and the organization is benefiting, then it's similar to the leadership conversation. But there's just slight implications here to think through when you might want to think about MI and when maybe you won't. So I'm going to just leave that there for you all to consider. There's definitely lots of conversations to have around the ethics and the application of motivational interviewing in the business setting and organizations and leadership. And this is hopefully just to key up some of your thinking and some of the conversations that we can continue to have to think about when is it appropriate to apply MI in what context.
Yes, thank you, Colleen. And so far, we have taken for granted that all of you actually do know what motivational interviewing is and how it works and what it is all about. But we are also aware that some of you may have functions, maybe leaders, where you perhaps don't know in details what your staff has learned about MI, and maybe you're not quite up to date in what MI is all about. So we just thought we would spend a few minutes just take you through just a little bit of what MI actually is for a type of conversation. We normally talk about. I think that. Do I have the power of the presentation? Oh, I did. Normally we talk about MI, when we talk about MI, we talk about phases in a conversation. And this is also how Colleen and I structured the book. And MI, in contrast to trying to persuade somebody to change, means or starts typically with trying to figure out what is actually on the person's mind. We call it engaging, or it's called in the engaging phase, where you try to create some kind of alliance with the person you talk with, but also really trying to understand what's on this person's mind. Colleen and I decided to often refer to it also as the listening phase. This is the phase where you try to figure out how the person thinks about the potential change. The next phase is the focusing phase. This is very similar to other kinds of therapies or types of conversations where you try, when you believe you have the picture of what's going on, or perhaps even check with the person that you talk to that this is a fully, or as full as it can be, understanding of the situation. Then you move into focusing and deciding what actually should be given priorities. The next phase, and this is the phase that's very unique to motivational interviewing, is the phase where you try help the individual in front of you be really clear about how they think about change, and where you try to help them create their own internal motivation for change, or believe in the possibility of change. And we'll get a little bit back to how this can be done. And the final phase is the planning phase. Again, pretty similar to what you normally would do when you try to implement change in, say, an organization. So these phases look pretty when you just describe them, and you can get the picture that this is just taking one step at a time, but this is, of course, not always like it will be. It will ever so often be walking up and down and taking a few steps up and then go a little bit back again because there was something that is missed. The communication strategies that you use is very much in contrast to trying to persuade people to make a change. It is very much about listening to the person's own argument or wishes for change, trying to make them grow, showing the person what he or she thinks and actually is considering, and at the same time acknowledging that there may be arguments for not changing, but on the other hand trying to calm that part a bit down. This is what we call softening sustained talk. Sustained talk being the talking about or the arguments for not changing, and we talk about increasing change talk or or cultivating change talk, even just like you're growing vegetables in the garden. So you allow them to, you feed them, you water them, you make them grow and blossom. And there are a series of strategies you use. Typically, instead of trying to argue, then you ask questions, ask for the person's view, in particular about change. You show people what they're saying. This is typically done by using reflections or strategic summaries, where you try to really help the person see the full picture of her potential change. So this is a brief introduction about, or reminding about what MI is. And now Colleen will talk a little bit about how this can be done, or how it might look like when you talk with, have an MI conversation with a staff employee, and I'll later get back to you how you can think about the full organization.
Thanks, Anette. So let's use a couple examples. So the first one is Rose, and Rose is an example of an employee that I worked with, but I've blended a few people together just for privacy. But she was somebody that was constantly getting feedback that she was coming off as if she was not interested in other people's opinions in meetings, and she was coming off a little bit more sort of an aggressive. So when I spoke with her about this is sort of how we would think about how motivational interviewing could help her. So we start first with the engaging phase and say to Rose, so I recently got some feedback that some of your colleagues are finding that it is hard to share their opinions in meetings with you because you're coming off a little bit more aggressive or assertive than they are comfortable with. And then just ask Rose, what does she think about that? And so with Rose, she shared that she understands what they're saying. She's just very passionate, and it's very important to her that she shares her opinions and that other people listen and not consider her opinions. But she also shared that she really did not want to be seen as aggressive, or that she didn't care about what other people wanted to share, because she actually did care very much about what other people wanted to share. And she wanted to actually create an opportunity to have a shared collaborative conversation in meetings. And so we go from engaging, which is Rose's view of this change, into focusing. So her and I decided that what we would do was focus on what, if anything, might she do about how to create this collaborative environment, this collaborative behavior in meetings, so that people do feel like she does want to hear what they have to say, but she's also able to share her own thoughts. So that's our focusing phase. Then we would move into evoking. And so sometimes in leadership, what we tend to do is go straight into advice giving. Here's what I think you might try. And instead, with MI, what we want to do is trust that Rose is the expert on herself. Rose has her own ideas and solutions, and I want to use the evocative processes and the evocative questions that MI has taught us to really bring that forward. So asking Rose, if she did make this change, why would she do that? What reasons does she have? What would be important about that? And sharing time with that. And Rose shared a lot about how it was really important to her to have trusting and confident relationships with her colleagues, how important it was for the work that she was doing to not only be heard, but to hear her colleagues, because she really did believe that diverse opinions make better solutions. She also shared that it was a growth opportunity for her to be able to both be passionate, not lose who she was, but also share her own thoughts. And then we'd also evoke around confidence. What does Rose think is possible? What does she think is sort of happening? And what ideas does she have about what might be different? And Rose shared it was really that she just gets passionate and just wants to share her thoughts because she gets so excited. And she came up with that maybe what she would try is, before she shared her own thoughts, she would just practice making sure she heard and reflected back understanding to the other people first. And so she wanted to implement a strategy of seeing that if she did this sort of one-to-one strategy of sharing her thought, reflecting understanding of other people's thoughts before she shares her own again, if that might help shift the dynamic. And so that's what she wanted to try. So that's our evoking process. And then we went to planning. How would she do that? What might get in the way? What obstacles might come up for her? And how will she know if she's making progress? So just as an example, that's how you can take one specific employee situation and think about how you could apply the 4 processes to help Rose decide what she wanted to do. Now, if we take Jim as an example, Jim was struggling with hiring new staff. He was a new supervisor. And he was sharing that in his process that he was really struggling because he kept hiring people that seemed to not end up working out for the role. And in the engaging process with Jim, actually what came out was that it was clear that he actually didn't receive much training on how to hire people. He wasn't sure about competency models or how to evaluate competencies. He was new to this altogether. And so one of the things that we did in the engaging process was, or to the focusing process, was to see what he thought would be most helpful. We could go through the MI conversation and see what ideas did he have, what did he think might be helpful, what did he would like to try. Or we could also look at this as maybe it's a skill opportunity and would he like some training and just some modeling of how to manage the hiring process. And in that situation, actually, what became clear was MI was not the most appropriate tool to use, because what Jim actually needed was just to be taught, trained, and modeled on how to use the right hiring process. Even though he was expressing ambivalence and some frustration with the hiring, he selected, and it seemed appropriate for him to stop the MI conversation and actually just move into training specifically on the skills. So we just wanted to highlight that because those are a couple examples of how you might think about MI in the application. But we just want to draw your attention to a couple things. First, employees have to feel safe to be able to change and be vulnerable. That means that we as leaders need to set up that environment where we are compassionate and accepting, and that it is okay for them to share with us both when they struggle and when they succeed. And there's a lot of things that go into people feeling safe. One of them is that they must trust us. And some of the things you shared that already in your feedback is trust is critical to leadership, and trust means consistency, honesty, direct feedback. And there's a lot of things that we want to think about, but without trust, it's very hard for employees to want to go through a process of change with us. We also have to think about how do we handle failure or the growing process, and that not just us, but how does our organization handle that? So often we expect people to make change overnight. And when you think about Rose's example, her ability to manage that kind of passion and not interrupting other people in meetings is going to take some practice and some time. She is not going to be able to do that tomorrow by clicking her fingers. And so we have to think about how do we monitor progress, how do we handle quote unquote failures, and how do we reflect that back to our employees, especially if we're growing through an organizational change. And then that ties back to just how do we communicate non-judgment, compassion, empathy, and understanding. And some of the basic skills of motivational interviewing can teach leaders how to do that specifically. And so often in leadership books, we're taught to do that, but we're not actually taught how to do that. And so even teaching your leadership teams or your supervisory teams the art of reflective listening and empathetic listening can make a huge difference in helping them better understand their employees, but also better express what they're actually thinking, feeling, and empathizing with their employees. And that's just to name a few. I'm sure you all are thinking of many other things that would tie into an employee feeling trusting enough to be vulnerable with us to go through the process of change and improvement. So back to you, Anette.
Thank you, Colleen. When Colleen and I started discussing how you can use or make use of MI or feel comfortable with MI as a leader in an organization and how it might benefit your leadership style or your way of being a leader, we actually began to think about the other challenges that you have as a leader when you try to implement change in the organization as such. I mean, now we move a little bit away from having individual talks with an employee who for some reason might benefit from change. And now we move into implementing change in the full organization. And I guess many of you have tried already. I seem to struggle. It's a long way from Denmark to the US. I can see that when I try to click this presentation. I guess many of you have tried to implement changes in the organization. Like Colleen said in the beginning of this webinar, implementing change is really one of the biggest tasks of a leader. It all happens to us that we have to implement, say, a new way of meeting patients or a new way of, or new tasks, taking care of significant others to our patients, or even implement perhaps strategies where people can feel safe in relation to COVID-19 when they come into our organization. I mean, there's a lot of change that needs to be implemented in organization, and all too often there's even several changes at the same time. And what we know from tons of research studies is that just telling staff to act differently typically does not mean that that change is implemented. We also know that the effect of courses and training not always lead to implementation of change. That also counts for motivational interviewing, where a lot of studies have been done showing that just sending staff to a one-day or a week training in MI doesn't mean that they are not always using MI with their clients. And even knowing, just like in Colleen's example, knowing that change should be done doesn't always lead to its actually implementing. And Colleen and I started discussing how is it at all possible to implement or to view change in an organization through the glasses or lenses of MI. And some of you may know this picture, which is taken from a book by a very classic book by Everett Rogers called Diffusion of Innovations. It's a relatively old book, but it's still a very highly recommendable book about how to implement change in a bigger scale and not just with the individual employee. And what this picture shows is that when we have our staff group in front of us, it will typically consist of some staff members who are very positive to a potential change, and some staff members who are not, who definitely prefer things like they are, and some people in between, and some who are just a little bit worried, and some who's more worried. And if you look at this group of staff members as a group or as an entity, you can actually say that this group is expressing organizational ambivalence towards change. And when Colleen and I started discussing that, it actually became, we got the idea that you could implement the same attitude and probably succeed with that. So if you try to consider implementing change in an organization, then what you typically very often tend to do as a leader is that you stand up in front of your staff, you tell them about some change that needs to be done, and perhaps you even tell them what should be done. But if you want to approach change in an MI style or an MI way, then of course you trust that a lot of knowledge about the change is already in the organization. And you know that when you think about it, that your staff is typically very much aware about what they're good at and what your organization can and where the weaknesses are. So the first process, the engaging process, is actually one that can be applied with organizations as well. And I'm sure that when you consider it a moment, this is what you have done ever so often. This is typically where you organize platforms, you organize workshops, you organize meetings where you try not to persuade your staff into changing, but try to listen to what's actually on their mind, what they think about a potential change, what are the good reasons for implementing it, and what are even the good ideas for how to do it. And of course, when it's noted that role modeling is a strong part of it, it's exactly just like Colleen said, it's also about being very, very consistent as a leader about that you're willing to listen to your staff. When it comes to focusing, this is also a process that is possible to do with the organization and not only with the individual employee. And when you think about it, I'm sure that you have all tried it ever so often. It's typically something you do when you brainstorm together with your staff groups, where you get a lot of ideas on how can we, for instance, make our treatment institutions safe for patients who come and worry about COVID-19, or how can you implement a stronger focus on supporting significant others to your clients. Then you get a lot of ideas out from your staff members. And I think that what Colleen and I discussed a lot, and this is also what we describe in the book, this is a phase where it actually is, it can be very beneficial for a process if the leaders stay a little bit quiet and simply ask and get the ideas instead of coming with all the leaders' good ideas herself. Typically, all the ideas are there, and they will come, and they will even come much more than we even expected. And typically, the focusing part is organizing these ideas and discussing with staff where to start and what makes most sense and what would be the best ideas to move on with. The evoking phase is, of course, the very core phase in MI, and this is where you try to resolve the ambivalence there may be in the organization. And similar to the individual, to having MI conversation with the individual employee, it is very much about recognizing that there, of course, are arguments against change, and there may be some things to worry about, but it's also allowing and reflecting all the good arguments that comes from the staff themselves, and try to be sure to create possibilities for those ideas to be brought forward. This is typically something you can do. We have several ideas in the book, and just to name a few, it is about a staff group conversation where you make sure that it's not just staff members who are reluctant towards change, but perhaps you create a format where everybody has a specific amount of time, so you make sure that people who are more willing or positive towards change can actually express their thoughts. It is about reflecting those changes back to the group. It is about having meetings where you yourself take on the task to write the minutes. So it's not just minutes of the meetings that describe what was the decision, but it's also minutes that describes the arguments, and in particular describes the views and the arguments from the group of staff who believe, who have ideas on how to perform change, and lift them forward to the whole organizations. Not ignoring that there are arguments against it, and of course they should be recognized in order not to produce a resistance, but it's very much about making sure that you get the arguments from within the organization lifted forward. It's about being consistent about the way you talk about change and you communicate about change. For instance, having newsletters where you lift good ideas forward and describing it. So you can simply have a view on the communication within the organization and make that inspired by motivational interviewing. The planning part is something that I think every leader gets used to or is used to. It is strategies that are known from, all the kind of work you do as a leader, is where, of course, you use all the usual way you will do that. I think the most important part when you talk about MI, using MI as a, I don't know what's actually called in English, but the high-end leader in an organization. If you are leader of a large staff group and you have to implement change in a full organization, it's very much about showing leadership. It's very much about listening, keep focusing, and have the focus on the complete communication, just like it is with the individual, and view the organization as an entity, and recognize that if the ambivalence in the organization can be resolved the same way with the same, more or less the same tools, but of course you have to translate them into the platforms or the instruments that you have in the organization. It's very much about reflecting, showing the staff that you're listening, and instead of trying to persuade or people into change, then try to evoke both the expertise and the wish for change from your employee and the belief that it can be done. So when you view the organization through the lens of MI, it is very much about believing in your employees, believing in the expertise within your employees, and recognize that they are the best ones to be specific about how change can be implemented, and they are the best ones to find and help out where change can best be implemented or be performed. So you may be the one as a leader that goes to that discusses with the organization, or tell the organization that there is a change we need to do. We need to, for instance, become better at implementing strategies for significant others, or implementing acute treatment, or there can be a lot of things that we need to do, but the how it's done and the good ideas on how it can be performed in real life is actually coming from the employee themselves. So it's MI is also about setting employees free, and that way ensuring ownership to change and practice, and also ensuring the solutions is actually possible to implement. And it was really fun and very inspiring for Colleen and I, and to actually work through also organizational change when you look upon it from through the lenses of MI. And I think that this is actually the conclusion, that in essence, MI can be helpful for leaders sometimes, just like Colleen was very clear about. The ethics has to be very considered, because MI is a very powerful way of communicating, and we definitely don't want to be tricky that way about stuff. We want to be honest, we want to be trustworthy, and we can use MI as a way of actually doing that in real life, but you have to have your values in place. But you can also not only use, or that's the wrong way of putting it, MI is not just helpful with a direct communication with the individual employee. MI is also a useful way of understanding how to approach the whole organization when you realize that changes has to be done, and in particular when you realize that not all your staff members are so keen on the idea, and some are more reluctant than others, and thereby express organizational ambivalence. And I think that was the last thing that I would say. Colleen, will you say a bit about the book?
Sure. Thanks, Anette. So we'd love for you guys to join in some conversations. We've created a couple platforms to encourage just ongoing conversation, because this is a new field for motivational interviewing. So if the book is interesting to you, please go ahead and grab one for yourself. There's a discount code you guys can use that we've included here. But we have also included a link to a LinkedIn group. Trying to get my page to turn. So there's the link. If you'd like to get the discount link, feel free to grab that, and there'll be copies of this afterwards. And then there's also several groups where people are having conversations about motivational interviewing. There's a group called Milo, which has been around now, I think, for about 2 years. I think that's right. They have both a Facebook group and a LinkedIn group, and there's several other Mint members on that organization as well that have been talking about how to apply motivational interviewing leadership and organization. And we've also created a book link for the book for those who read our books to contribute to the conversation too. But we just encourage you all, if this is a topic you're interested in, please collaboratively share your ideas and thoughts. We'd love to hear how you're applying it, where you're finding that there's points where maybe it's not so helpful, and any other thoughts that you guys might have would be hugely helpful. And I know that was a lot of information in a very short time. It's hard to cram this all into the small time that we have together. So we'll stop there for now, and we're going to turn it over to you all and see what questions you might have and what we can answer for you.
Great. Thank you, Colleen and Annette, for the great presentation. We appreciate you taking time today. While people are typing their questions into the chat box, I thought I would share, if I could go ahead and skip to the next slide here. I thought I'd share some other opportunities for more exploring more motivational interviewing topics. We just launched a new podcast series with our partners at Kaplan and Heinz. I think we have 12 available right now for viewing, and we're adding those on a monthly basis. We keep adding to those, and they're free and available now. And I'll go ahead and post that in the chat box, a link to that, but you can find it on our website under the Training and Education tab. So I encourage you, if you want to keep learning about MI, this is a good opportunity for you, and I just posted it there. Let's go to some of the questions here. Let's see, one of them was motivation interviewing with clinical supervision. I guess someone was asking if that's a possible topic. I'm guessing that that's what they're trying to ask here.
Yeah, actually, and Annette, please join too, but I actually have been teaching motivation interviewing as a supervision process for a while and have a couple videos available too if you're interested. I'd be happy to share that out too, because they're models similar to how we've done when you train MI, you show a everyday practice and then an MI practice so people can kind of compare the difference. So I do think it's very appropriate for clinical supervision. Similarly to leadership though, there's times where you wouldn't do MI because you actually need to teach or train or model something for somebody, which is not the same thing as using the MI process. But I also found oftentimes when somebody's a little bit further in their training, MI can be extremely helpful. And it can be applied similarly to how you would apply it as a leadership role. Annette, would you add anything to there?
No, I completely agree. It is definitely a helpful tool when you're giving supervision, actually all kinds of supervision. But of course, you have to be aware that when there's a question about feeling ambivalent or feeling reluctant towards trying something out, and when the person in front of you simply do not know what to do, because then you will have perhaps to simply demonstrate and tell people.
Yeah.
Great. Let's see here. I think we had the link to the book on the former slide, but if not, I can go ahead and find that out, and we can include that in our email that goes out later this afternoon to everybody so that you can grab that again. And that's for the MI book series that you guys just listed, but I think it was on a former slide, so that'll be available on our website. And let's see, I'll go ahead and post the link to our survey. If you could take a minute and complete that survey, we would greatly appreciate it. It helps us kind of learn what topics are important to you guys. And see if I get another question here. Trying to summarize this. Can we have information on the DVD that are used for this? I wasn't sure if that was included on the former slide. Maybe we can jump back to that, but.
Yeah, we don't have DVDs yet divide for this book, but I think the way they were referencing the MI and supervision, they're on YouTube actually, from my former organization actually hosted them. So I'm happy to send you the link if you want to send them out in the email as well.
Great, we can do that later this afternoon as well. Just include all of these links that you had posted and summarize those again. Any other questions that people have? This is more of a comment, but someone said that they really like the diagram exploring the appropriateness of MI in the organizations and how it translates. So thank you for putting that graphic together for us.
Thank you for that. In the book, we actually have some specific examples too. So it has the matrix of the model, but then also some specific examples to bring it to life, because sometimes it's easier to understand from thinking about specifically where would somebody have a bias. Annette, you were going to say something. I cut you off.
No. You put it. You speak so beautifully English.
So do you.
So, I'm sorry for nodding my head and just expecting you to answer. So sorry.
Nice. Let's see. This one's more about the podcast series, but someone asked, is the Talking to Change link posted here in today's webinar? You'll see it in the chat box, but I'm not sure links that are on the PowerPoints. I don't think they work necessarily for participants to click on directly, but you can visit our website. It's up here on this slide here, attcnetwork.org/Northwest. And if you go under the Training and Education tab, that's where those are all located. And right now we have I think 11. We may have posted 12 now, so I think there are 12 available. So feel free to check that out. And go ahead and if you are interested in joining us for our next webinar series, we have that scheduled for September 30th. That topic is still to be determined, but we should have that posted on our website here in the next week or so as well, with an advertisement that'll go out to our listserv. So if you're on our listserv, you'll get that topic. Any other questions that people have? I'll give people another minute to type those in. I know it's kind of hard to listen and type at the same time. We're getting a lot of comments, Annette and Colleen, saying thank you, and they really appreciate the wonderful information that you've given today. Let's see. Can you give a specific example of when MI would be appropriate? There are a lot of gray areas.
Yeah, I think they said inappropriate. So I can think of specific times, like when somebody just needs to be taught a skill. If you think about someone who's brand new to an organization and doesn't yet know what is asked of them, to not actually lean into just teaching them would be really unkind. And so rather than trying to vote for them their own ideas and what might they want to do, that's an opportunity to actually teach. And we talk about a model of that in the book, about thinking about the different leadership style you might bring to it. But I've also had the situation where an employee is asking you specifically to give your advice and your feedback to them, like in the professional development situation. And so to not do that, I think would be not kind also. So if somebody's specifically saying, I've had people, just because I tend to model MI most of the time in my supervisions, they'll say, I don't want you to do MI right now. I want to actually hear what you have to say. And so that would be a time you would just lean into, they're asking something specifically of you, and so you want to be able to provide that. But more importantly, the ethics part is when you are, so if you are going to benefit from the change, an employee could hurt from the change. So the easy example is if you think about covering a clinic, and you know that if the employee works overtime, it might hurt their family and they might miss out on family time. But you yourself, if they don't cover overtime, have to work the overtime. So if you're trying to talk with them about whether or not they wish to take on these extra hours and get the extra money, you have a strong bias to try to convince or lean or persuade them into working the overtime, because you yourself don't get extra money being a salaried person, and you probably don't really want to work the overtime. That's just a specific example of how it can come up, but it can come up in so many ways. But it really is this question of being really clear who is going to benefit from this change. And if I'm going to benefit from this change as the leader, I have to be really careful and decide whether or not I want to use MI at all. So that's just a quick example. And do you have any that you'd want to share?
No, I think you covered them all. Of course, it's very unethical if it is something where you, in essence, if the staff member doesn't do what you're hoping they would do, she will get fired. Then of course that's not ethical not to tell them in a way that where you are in that situation. I think that's, I mean, if the answer is given beforehand, then it's not, then I don't think it's ethical to use MI. And that would be.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there, Annette, is also being really clear about what I would call the playing field or the groundwork. Yeah. So oftentimes to be able to say to an employee, I cannot change this expectation. You must do X, Y, or Z if you're wanting to keep the job that you have in front of you. However, how you go about, figuring out how to accomplish X, Y, or Z, there's a lot of room for creativity there, and we could use MI to figure the middle part out. But if we try to use MI as if the employee actually gets to decide what their job is or what the outcomes are that they're being asked to do, that's unkind as well. So we want to just be really clear with people. And that ties back to a lot of the things that you guys were sharing about being honest, being consistent and having integrity and giving direct feedback. Because employees know if they're not doing well, they know if they're not meeting the expectations of their role often. And we don't want to pretend that that's not true, but we do want to be clear about here's the ask, here's the expectation of the job that you've chosen. And if you want to keep this job, which of course is a choice, they could choose not to keep that job. But if you want to keep this job, then here is the places where we could talk and where MI might be helpful. But these are the boundaries where we cannot adjust.
And just to continue that a bit, I mean, this is really, you could say that this is rather special for leadership in MI, that you have the power as a leader, and you have to be honest about that, and you also have to take care of the complete organization and not only the individual employees. So that also, and to have specific tasks that you have to do. So you have to balance that. But in a way, when you think about it, it's not that different from when you meet clients. There are certain boundaries there as well. I mean, you can use MI as a therapist, you can use MI with the client, but there are also boundaries. You have a certain amount of time. You have something that's agreed upon. You have to have a client, for instance, that if you don't follow therapy, then perhaps he will not be able to see his kids, or he will get divorced or whatever. So in a way, it's the same kind of thinking, that we have to balance between that there's something you have to be honest about the boundaries, but you also have to, within that, you have a room where MI can make a lot of sense to be, and really a beautiful attitude and helpful way of communicating with people.
Great, thank you. I appreciate you answering that question. I think this one is asking, are there any resources for talking change within a union process?
I'm not sure I know what a union process is.
I don't think we have anything specific, but a union is where the employees and the organization sort of negotiate contracts together. So my guess actually, Annette, is in the settings you've worked in, you might not call them unions, but that's the structure that you've been working in.
So it's where you negotiate whether you have to get increased pay or.
Right.
Sorry, I'm Danish. I'll just stay.
Well, that's why I was thinking that the Danish organizations actually are very similar. So it is. I have not worked myself in a union setting, so I can't speak to that specifically. But it is where both the management and the union leader or the employee leaders would sort of negotiate and discuss different deliverables. So it is about pay and budget, but it's also about job expectations at times.
Okay. I have a comment on that because actually I do think that MI is pretty is a useful way of looking both upon the conversation, but also it is helpful to make a solution of the negotiation that both parts, both sides of the table can get satisfied with, because it is very much about listening carefully to what the other part is saying and showing the other part that what you understand, and that is always beneficial for a good outcome of a negotiation. So you can say that there definitely, communication style here that might be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. especially if, you know, I know one thing that I've done in organizations is taught my leadership team motivational interviewing so that we had a common way of talking to each other too. So if there was an agreement between the leadership and the union leaders to use motivational interviewing to listen and understand each other's perspectives, I can imagine that would help in the discussion and the negotiations.
And I would even say that, say one part is slightly more aggressive and don't necessarily know about MI or not have been taught or not naturally use an MI consistent style, then you can actually help that person to move into a more productive way of communicating with you if you use an MI-centered style of communicating. MI is very effective actually to decrease anger and to decrease frustration.
Yeah.
Great. It looks like we've reached the end of our 1 hour here. So thank you so much, Annette and Colleen, for speaking today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and thank you to our attendees. We appreciate you taking the time to fill out our survey again, and then we'll be sending an email later this afternoon with the resources that were discussed during this presentation, along with the survey link again, and a link to see a recording of this webinar. So thank you again, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening.